Welcome to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council with hosts Grace Evans and Moses Brattrud. Stay informed on the top stories on life, family, and religious freedom. Get the facts, stand for truth. Hello and welcome back to the Family Beacon podcast. My name is Grace Evans and my co-host Moses Brattrud is actually out of the country still, and I'm so excited he was able to take that trip. But in his absence, I have invited John Helmberger, MFC's CEO, onto the podcast, along with Jeff Evans, who is MFC's incoming CEO. And not to worry, for we will be doing an episode shortly with Jeff about his transition plans, how we've really been blessed with amazing leadership by John over the past years, and how Jeff is excited to take up the baton with John's support. So stay tuned for that episode. But meanwhile, I have them both on the podcast to talk about what happened this week throughout the nation, actually, in our elections. We actually saw some major losses for the pro-life cause in many different states. And Republicans are saying, not every Republican, but some Republicans are saying that due to this loss in many pro-life elections, many pro-life leaders lost out on elections, guys. I'm not gonna lie to you here. They're saying that due to this, candidates need to be more moderate and they should compromise at 15 weeks. Now, right up front, I want to say to you guys that as Minnesota Family Council, we support any win we can possibly get on life. And if that means taking a win at 15 weeks and saving some babies from abortion, we absolutely are going to take it. But we're also not going to stop there. We're not going to stop fighting until every child is protected from the moment of conception. So in this episode, I've invited John and Jeff on to offer their insight and really give some pushback on the thought that you can just stop protecting life at 15 weeks, that 15 weeks is enough. So John is going to share how the law is a moral teacher and how that applies to the abortion debate. Then Jeff is going to explain how we as pro-life Christians can winsomely move forward with courage, with faithfulness, and with shrewdness. We're also going to break down what happened in Ohio, Kentucky, and Virginia and share what went wrong, but also share how we can use this as a learning field to seek to build a culture of life here in our own state. Without further ado, John, thank you so much for joining us on this week's podcast. Go ahead and offer your insight here.
Well, Grace, it's my pleasure to be here and join you. As we have shared many times in the past, at the foundation of Minnesota Family Council's vision for citizenship worthy of the gospel of Christ, and for the sake of the gospel, is this simple idea from the scriptures, that law is a moral teacher. Law teaches. And in an increasingly secularized society like ours, law is the only moral teacher that many people recognize. And so laws that are good, that are consistent with God's law, don't make people good. They teach people what is good and help them recognize that they're sinners in need of a savior. On the other hand, laws that are not consistent with God's law affirm people in their sin. They teach wickedly, affirming people in their sin and dulling their senses to their need of a savior. So when we talk about citizenship worthy of the gospel, we're talking about advancing good laws and opposing bad laws, because law is a moral teacher. And we want to till the soil of our culture's heart through what law teaches to receive the seed of the gospel and give our culture ears to hear it. Well, what we experienced this week with the election especially in Ohio and Virginia, as well as other places around the country, was a really painfully clear example of how profound an impact law can have as a moral teacher. And especially what we saw happen with the passage of a pro-abortion constitutional amendment in Ohio and the defeat of pro-life legislators in the state of Virginia is an illustration of how profoundly Roe v. Wade, over a period of nearly 50 years, instructed our culture about what's right and wrong, especially with respect to the value of human life and the importance of personal freedom and the priorities between those two things. And our friend Joe Rigney said that especially powerfully in a. I'm trying to bring this up on my computer screen and it's not coming.
Yeah, he's pulling up a tweet right now that Joe tweeted out, I think yesterday. And, Joe always just has such brilliant insight. And he was the former president of the school I graduated from. So we're always just so grateful when he cuts through that cultural noise just so concisely, so clearly.
Yeah. Yes. And here's how he put it: the impact of Roe v. Wade in nearly 50 years of cultural instruction. It produced a cultural conviction that sex must not have consequences. Susie's dreams must not be derailed by a baby. 50 years of cultural instruction by Roe v. Wade teaches a wicked and has instilled a wicked custom that suppresses the light of the moral law written on the heart. And he recognizes, as we do, that recovering from the lies of the Roe regime that have been instilled over the last 50 years is going to take time and what he described as spirit-wrought effort, especially to overcome that deep and lasting cultural conviction. And we saw that cultural conviction instilled by Roe v. Wade as a moral teacher over the last 50 years. We saw that play out in the votes in the state of Ohio on their abortion ballot question and in legislative elections in the state of Virginia, where it seems that though we celebrated the overturn of Roe v. Wade last year, that understanding of how the value of human life is subservient to personal freedom has become so pervasive, it's been so deeply embedded in our culture that we have a big challenge before us and a lot of work to do, and it's going to take time. But so that's a long-term perspective, but what about the battle that's immediately ahead of us with the big elections in Minnesota next year, where our state House of Representatives is going to all be on the ballot, and there's an opportunity potentially to flip the majority in our state House and achieve a pro-life majority in our state House of Representatives. There's also the potential that we'll have an equal rights amendment on our ballot that will include both protections for abortion and for gender identity and expression, both things that we at Minnesota Family Council are very concerned about. So what can we learn from what's happened this week about the battles that are immediately in front of us with next year's election? Jeff has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's right. So we're working on strategy and tactics, what that's going to look like in 2024. We don't want to let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, too quickly on that, but we're deep at work on that, have been. And this is just another I don't want to say just data set, but another example here with the elections that we take into consideration and cultivating into the plan going forward. But I'm going to talk about strategy and tactics all day. What I want to do is kind of set the temperature of how we ought to be looking at the future going ahead. And I want to do this pastorally. I mean, that's my background being a pastor and then engage with pastors at the Capitol. And so hard for me to be nudged out of that, which is a good thing, I think. So there are three things that I've been talking about with various folks, various political operatives, candidates, people in-house as well. And I think this is really important for believers to get. So there are three things that are, I think, non-negotiables for us if we're thinking about what to do in 2024. And these are three things that every believer should be able to do and should remind themselves every day. This is what I'm called to do. There's more, but these three things, if one of the three is missing, then it's a no-go. We need all three things, and you need to encourage everybody who is naming the name of Christ to operate this way. So those three things are courage, faithfulness, and shrewdness, as you said at the beginning, Grace. And let me unpack those a little bit for you. First of all, courage. So in Revelation 21, if you read that, verse 8, you see that there are certain people who don't inherit eternal life. They actually inherit the lake of fire. It's one of those fiery, scary passages. And you think about the list of sins that end in destruction, right? So Sexual immorality would be one of those we probably come to mind. You probably have a list of those vices, of those deep sins that you think, okay, detestable. We don't want that even named among us. The first thing that is mentioned in it, however, is the cowards. The cowards inherit the lake of fire. So God doesn't just dislike cowardice, he hates it, right? It's contrary to his character, and it's contrary to what we are to adorn ourselves with in this life. And so that doesn't mean you can't be afraid. Doesn't mean that you have to be just steely in your nerve, but it does mean that all of us every day, we need to wake up and we need to act courageously in the name of Christ. So we're called to courage, and we should be of great courage. You think about this, if Joshua is to be encouraged, to be strong and courageous in Joshua 1, how much more for us living on this side of the resurrection? The tomb is empty, everybody, right? We believe that. If it wasn't empty, we should just all go home. And Jesus is ruling and reigning at the right hand of the Father. So every day is a good day to be in his service. And we have to act courageously. So you have to have courage, biblically defined. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we need to be faithful. And for that, I could point at Revelation 21 as well, because the unfaithful, that's the next category of people that inherit destruction. But I want to go to a different place. I want to go to 1 Timothy 6, where Paul is telling Timothy, a young pastor, to warn those who are rich in this age not to trust in the uncertainty of riches, but rather place their hope in God. And riches, money, if you have wealth, that's a means of being able to exert control, power in life. There can be good ways to be wealthy. There can be bad ways. The scriptures are filled with that. But I think it's not unfair to see wealth in that passage as a placeholder also for power and influence. And there's a way in which we as believers, unfortunately, can put our hope and our trust first and foremost in power or influence or wealth and riches. And for here, we could put it into a political party or a political process or our own good ideas, our own strategies, our tactics for 2024. We're tested continually. Where's our hope? Are we faithful to God, or are we faithful to ourselves or to something else? And those other things can be good. You want to be faithful to your family. You want to be faithful to Minnesota. All those things are good. But if our faithfulness is not first to God, then we're going to not have his blessing. We could have the best ideas and we'll have the worst outcomes because God isn't in it. So we've got to be faithful. Every day is a call to faithfulness to God, a faithfulness to Jesus Christ, courageously in our culture. So that's the second thing. First, courage. Second, we've got radical faithfulness that we've got to get back to. And political operatives need to hear that. I hope they're listening, hear this, right? And then thirdly, and this hits hard for us, let's just be honest, we need to be shrewd. So Jesus warns his disciples in the Gospel of Matthew. This is Matthew 10. He's going to be sending them out. They're going to be doing their missionary thing, and they're going to receive some real opposition, and they're going to actually have to answer in court at times. And among the things that he tells them to do, he tells them to be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. Oftentimes in the evangelical church, we emphasize the innocence part, but innocence doesn't mean being naive. We want to be innocent. We want to be pure, but we also want to be shrewd. This is the crass way of saying it. Stupid for Jesus is still stupid. We've got friends who tell us this, and we try to remind ourselves because we can be foolish at times. Foolishness is not commendable. It's not commendable. That's right. And it doesn't make the list in Revelation 21. So there's something to be forgiven here. But we've got to ditch foolishness, and we've got to put on shrewdness. Mm-hmm. We have to learn how to be very, very shrewd in our speech. We got to be disciplined with it. We've got to have the best message. We've got to go back to it over and over again. That message has to actually harmonize with Scripture and with what God says, not just our own good ideas, right? And so we've got to be courageous. We've got to be faithful. We've got to be shrewd, all biblically defined, not defined on ourselves. And we have to know that sometimes you can say you're being shrewd, but really that's a mask for being a coward. This is where all three have to be operative at once. Oh, well, we need to go 15 weeks. Well, are you being a coward with that, or are you being courageous? Because if you're being courageous with that, then we can get after it. If that's just a mask for cowardice, we want nothing to do with it. We want nothing to do with cowardice. So, and likewise, you can say you're being courageous, paint your face blue and run out on the battlefield, metaphorically speaking, and scream at your opponents. That's just being foolish. You're not being shrewd. Stop doing that. That's not courageous biblically defined. That's just being a chest-thumping troglodyte. You need to stop. Just sit down, have, as a good friend of mine says, have a juice box and some crackers. And then we'll come back later when you've grown up a little bit. So, and we know that, right? Like I say that, but I've got my own foolishness. Let's just be really honest with ourselves. So we've got to be courageous. We got to be faithful. We got to be shrewd, all three together. And you don't emphasize one at the expense of the other. I think those three things help us navigate how we're going to go ahead. If we've got those things, and there's more, it's not a total summary, but we've got those three things that we can remember, and then we apply them to our lives, we've got more than a fighting chance. We got the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. You hear that, Minnesota rulers? The Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, whom we serve, and whom he loves us and wants to hear from us and wants to work through us. And so be encouraged. God has placed us in these very hard times. This is true. And yet hard times are not bad times necessarily. These are hard times that God's given for us to be faithful to him, right? To be courageous in him, to be shrewd in him, and to show the world a better way, right? We want to care for women. We want to care for children. We want to show what a glorious thing it is to live in Minnesota, to be raised up here and to pass away here, right? To live all of life from womb to tomb in Minnesota. That's a winning message. We just need to get back to basics, start working on it. So be encouraged. God's placed us at a very pivotal moment, and he doesn't require us to be perfect. He requires us to be faithful. He doesn't require us to just not have any fears or whatever. He calls us to courage in him, in Christ, who's actually conquered the grave. We can be of good courage. And he's called us to be shrewd. And we don't have to come up with all the ways to be shrewd. He's given us his word to teach us wisdom that's way beyond what is even finding out in human understanding. So these are good times, even though they're hard times, to be a believer. So that's my encouragement going forward for everyone.
I was just going to say that was a huge mic drop. Proud to call you my dad right now.
There's a really powerful example of how not to do what Jeff was just talking about in the election this week in Virginia, where our friends there tell us about ProLife Candidates who followed the advice that they were getting from their political consultants, and they refused to talk about abortion, even while their very pro-abortion opponents were relentlessly branding them as anti-abortion extremists. They refused to respond to those allegations, and they simply went after their opponents on the basis of crime, because their consultants were telling them that crime was a hot button that voters were responding to. So they talked about crime, they refused to talk about abortion, and they lost races they should have won because of it. The point is this: Republicans, conservative candidates, pro-life candidates must not refuse to talk about abortion in the upcoming election, because they think somehow if they talk about abortion, it's going to hurt them. They have plenty of consultants that are advising them that way. They must talk about abortion, because their opponents are going to brand them as extremists on the issue if they don't define themselves and where they're coming from courageously, faithfully, and shrewdly as a pro-life candidate. They will be branded as extremists, and they will be defeated on that subject. We must not let opponents define us. We must forthrightly, honestly, courageously, and shrewdly define ourselves.
Right. And you can be courageous and shrewd in such a way that you say, well, I'm going to address this for a moment, but the bigger issue here, and you pivot to something that actually people really want to hear. You can go on record. You don't have to unpack every single thing. Sometimes people, in being good-hearted but naive, get baited into unpacking everything on abortion. You don't need to do that. That's not what we're saying here. You can be really shrewd, and you look how Jesus is asked questions by the Pharisees and the scribes and so on in his days. They're religious leaders, but they're also political leaders. We sometimes miss that. So Jesus is interacting with political leaders, and our political leaders today are still religious in a sense. Many of them are just secularists, which is its own religion. It's not really a fun religion, by the way, but so they're still religious in that respect. But back to the point, when Jesus interacts with them, they ask him all sorts of questions to trap him, and he says, "Let me tell you a story," and then he pivots to the real matter. And we're not the Son of God, so we don't know hearts like Jesus does, but we can still learn something from the way that he refuses to ask the entrapping question or refuses to answer it the way that they want, and he brings out what's important. That's just good message discipline, being shrewd and being genuine, and not going along with play that's being run on you. So you can do that, to be really clear. And there's a lot of work that all of us need to have on that kind of shrewdness, not just in the political realm, but you can translate this to the spiritual realm of your own life. There are ways in which your sin tells you in your own heart, right? Hey, do this. And you're like, wait, that's a twisted lie. And you don't have to engage it the same way. Has God really said, right? Like Satan in the garden. You have to learn how to pivot and actually speak the truth in the moment to yourself or to the culture at large. And those are hard things, but those are really good things for us to learn. So
yes, indeed.
Let's seize that. And again, not use this as an opportunity to be cowards, because nobody likes to follow a coward. People love to follow those who are courageous, who speak the truth, who are faithful. Those are inspiring leaders. Mealy-mouthed, milquetoast kind of people who pretend like they want to lead, but are refusing to be courageous and say the challenging thing, the hard thing in a winsome way, godly way. People won't follow that. So if you're watching this and you fall in that category, you're on notice. You won't have people following you.
And the kind of shrewd messaging that Jeff was just talking about requires good intel on what people really think about the subject at hand and what kind of messages they'll respond to, so that when we speak about the subject, we're not speaking merely hoping that we're hitting people where they're responsive and delivering messages that they will be responsive to. We need to know that. We need good intel to know that. And that's why we're engaged in a comprehensive message research project right now, exactly to achieve that, to understand what people think about abortion and about gender, and to understand what messages to learn through various kinds of focus group and survey techniques, to learn what kind of messages they'll respond to, so that we will understand exactly how to speak on these subjects in a way that will draw people our way, will draw people to the truth about abortion and about gender identity.
Absolutely. I do briefly want to look at Ohio and kind of just apply everything that you guys have been saying to what happened there. We already did briefly touch on it, but I want to remind you guys what exactly they were voting on in Ohio. It was called Issue 1, and Issue 1 allows abortions up to birth. It allows sex change without parental consent, which unfortunately we see that in Minnesota now. And it also eliminates the requirement of abortions to be performed by a licensed doctor who can transfer women to a hospital in the case of emergencies. So that's a lot of really bad stuff packed into Issue 1, right? And I bring that up. I bring up those bad things about Issue 1 to really illustrate a point here. I want to just take a minute to bring out a few things that we can learn from Ohio about the fight for life. And this really is in line with what John and Jeff are saying about having courage, having faithfulness and shrewdness. And I think that when we're faithful to God, God rewards that faithfulness by giving us courage and by giving us shrewdness. Even when maybe we are afraid, the Holy Spirit lives in us and gives us those things. And so here are some takeaways from Ohio that I think we can take home here to Minnesota, and we can really live out courageously. We can live out with shrewdness and be faithful to God in our state. So the first thing is that I think we learned that our messaging really matters when we look at Ohio, and we've known this forever. But specifically with Issue 1, the pro-abortion messaging of Issue 1 was very deliberately misleading to constituents. If you read it, I'm not going to read it right now, but you guys can easily look it up. If you read it, it's confusing because it covers a lot of different things, first of all, and it also brings up things like ectopic pregnancies and miscarriage care. It brings up things like that, and that tugs on people's heartstrings, rightly, as those things rightly should. And so the messaging really matters, and it was deliberately misleading to the constituents of Ohio. So messaging matters is the first takeaway. The second takeaway that I think that we can take from Ohio's loss is that the media's twisting of the narrative really has a massive impact. And that's why we need Christian-run media outlets more than ever. We need Christians to be excellent in whatever sphere they're in, but we really need excellent Christians in the media space. And I think it's easy to sit down after these losses and despair. It's easy to do that because of what the media is saying. But that's why we are bringing you an alternative media source here at the Family Beacon podcast, because we have to keep the long game in view. We have to keep the fact that God is on our side in view, and we have to keep in mind what John was saying about how Roe did almost 50 years of damage on our land, teaching people a certain thing, because the law is a moral teacher, as he pointed out. And so it's not surprising at all. And we need to completely disregard what progressive media is saying on this issue. But at the same time, we need to realize that, that has a huge impact on how people vote. I think there's a third thing that we can really learn from what happened in Ohio, and that is that money matters in the fight for life. If you look at what happened in Ohio, the pro-life cause was actually outspent by over $12 million in Ohio by pro-abortion advertising, which is insane. Over $12 million. So that's a huge amount. And, usually we are going to be outspent by the opposition. But I have great confidence that you and I, if we work together, we can outnumber the opposition. Now, how does that happen? That happens with you and I speaking up boldly in our day-to-day life. It happens with us saying something as simple as, I don't agree with that. I think you're wrong on that. Abortion is X. Pregnancy resource centers provide so many resources for women in need. It really just happens with us speaking up like that. That's how we outnumber the opposition. And then the final thing that I think we can learn from Ohio and apply to our state is that unity matters. Now, I'm really grateful for all of the pro-life groups that stood up for life in Ohio and for their boldness. But at the same time, there was no decisive unified campaign in Ohio to defeat issue 1. Each pro-life group was definitely waging their own thing and waging their own battle against this, but there wasn't this cohesive, unified entity that was fighting against the big pro-abortion giant, Goliath, right? And so on our state level here in Minnesota, what are we doing? What is Minnesota Family Council doing? Well, we can't give away everything we've been working on because, of course, we have some strategy that is pretty secretive for good reason. But one thing I can tell you is that we've already held a strategy meeting with over 100 pro-life leaders in our state. That includes leaders from pregnancy resource centers. That includes staff from MFC, staff from other leading pro-life organizations. We all came together and we really worked on doing an extensive messaging seminar and strategy seminar. And we just sat down and prayed and thought about what we could really do to win in Minnesota for life. And, that also included pastors. There were so many leaders there at that group. And so we're already ahead on the game here. We are working to unify pro-life groups in our state. And I think if we're unified, we can make a big change. So those are 3 things that I think really matter in the fight for life. Again, messaging, media, money, and unity. And here in Minnesota, we're already well on our way to working towards those things. We're already well on our way to, looking at Ohio and figuring out how we can do better in our state. So John and Jeff, do you have any thoughts there on Ohio that I didn't cover?
I'll defer to John. Please, anything you'd like to
Well,
add?
one thought. Jesus commended the sons of this age, he called them, for their shrewdness. We have to recognize that our opponents are shrewd, often, very shrewd, often more shrewd than we are. That's one of the reasons why we are so emphasizing shrewdness now. But in Ohio, the supporters of the abortion ballot question there were very shrewd in the way they worded that ballot question. They recognized
yes.
What we're also seeing among voters here in Minnesota and has been showing up nationally among voters, and that is that the great majority of voters, on the order of 70% more or less, are opposed to the very extreme abortion regime that we have in Minnesota right now and elsewhere that permits abortion anytime for any reason right up until the moment of birth, and even allowing children that survive an abortion to die without care, even though they're born alive. So the advocates for this abortion amendment in Ohio recognized that there was a very strong majority that was resisting the extremeness of the pro-abortion regime. So they shrewdly worded their ballot question so that it would make abortion legal up until viability, is the way they worded it, which is, it can be anywhere from 15 to 20 weeks. Science keeps, medical technology keeps improving viability and bringing that date earlier and earlier in the term. But in any case, they worded their ballot question to permit abortion up until viability, and then even after that, on the order of a doctor to save the life or quote unquote health of a woman, which is a loophole that allows abortion for any reason. If you've got a doctor who's making money off of abortions, he's going to say a woman needs that abortion for the sake of her health, even if her life is not at risk in it. So it essentially is permitting abortion right up until the moment of birth. But it looks on the surface, the wording of it, it taps into that revulsion on the part of the majority of voters against this kind of extreme abortion regime that we have now, to make it sound like it was much more moderate. And that is something that is the same kind of shrewdness. They were using shrewdness for evil purposes. It's the same kind of shrewdness that we need to pursue here as we fight for life.
Mm-hmm. John, I'm really glad that you broke that down, the specifics there of how misleading the wording was. I do want to end the podcast on a hopeful note. I mean, I hope this entire podcast has been hopeful for you guys, just with everything that John and Jeff have been sharing. But I just want to remind you guys, as we close out, some reminders about where we've been winning. And after I do that, I'll turn it back to John and Jeff for any final thoughts they want to add before we close the episode. But I just want to remind you guys that 14 states are protecting all preborn children. And now we wouldn't even have that opportunity to protect children from the moment of conception if Roe v. Wade hadn't been overturned, which, by the way, we won after about almost 50 years of trying. And then also 2 states are actually protecting the preborn from after just 6 weeks gestation. And then 2 states are also protecting the preborn after 12 weeks. And that is just so incredible. And, Roe's downfall has led to us be able to do that. And, we won't stop fighting until every single child is cherished in our country, but also in our state specifically. And so I just want to end my portion with a quote from Michael New, who tweeted out this. He said that we were never promised a smooth glide path to victory. This is an important lesson because history tells us when we persist, we win. And I think that's so true. When we persist, we win. God gives us victories, and we have to be in it to play the long game in the fight for life. John and Jeff, do you have a closing thought, encouragement, or verse before we end this episode?
Yeah, I'll just give you one closing thought. And that is, I think in all of us, if you're paying attention to this podcast, if you're involved in the pro-life movement, you have a sense of what many people do, even outside of this, a sense of like we're called to great things. Like all of us want to live our life in such a way that it matters, and we do things that are of value, right? That's inherent in, I think, everybody, regardless of your political affiliation, religious background. It's just part of the image of God that's in there. We strive for things. We want to make our lives matter. And I want to remind you that great men and women in the scriptures, I can't think of any example of great men and women who have left a mark, who've left a heritage, have left an inheritance to the generation that's following, which is what we want to do, right? That none of them are great because they had an easy life or because times were soft. Great men and women come out of great hardship, where they understand the greater glory of God in the midst of the hardship, and they see just how great his grace is to people who find themselves in dark, challenging, difficult times. And God makes his name known through them because they trust him. They're willing to act courageously. They're willing to be faithful. They're willing to be shrewd. And then God does something because it's not about them. It's about who God is. And that's exactly the recipe that we have going right now. So this is, not to be too cliche, but this is a call to greatness for Minnesota. This is a call to greatness for men and women in the church. Are we going to rise up? Are we going to follow the Lord? Or are we going to be put in our place by people who are opposed to the Lord's dealings we know how seriously God takes them. And I don't want to be too flippant with this. God's first reaction in Psalm 2 to those who will say they'll throw off his son's ways is that he laughs. That's how seriously God takes it. And then God does judge, and there's a seriousness with that as well. But we should not be robbed of joy, contentment in the Lord, given the hardships that we have here today.
Mm-hmm.
We need to roll up our sleeves, and we need to get after it every single day in our own lives, our own families, spheres of influence that we have, not overemphasizing things, being content with whatever God gives to us. But he's given us hard times. He's going to accomplish great things. We can trust him in that. Let's go.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would share from John 1:5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. Indeed, the darkness cannot overcome the light. And one thing that means, if we really believe that, if we really believe that the light shines in the darkness and the darkness does not overcome it, then we must recognize that if we're shining, we're winning. Even when we see setbacks like we saw this week in the elections around the country, if we're shining, we're winning. And if we need to look high enough and think big enough to see that and keep shining.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Thank you for those encouraging and powerful words, John and Jeff. It was a joy to have you guys both on the podcast. And I look forward to airing another podcast with Jeff soon. To our audience, thank you so much for tuning in this week. Be encouraged. And remember that we release a new podcast episode every single Friday. So tune back in next week to have another podcast with me and Moses, where you can get the facts and stand for truth. Thanks for listening to or watching this episode of the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you're up to date on life, family, and religious freedom. You can follow us on Instagram at MN Family Council and subscribe to us on YouTube to watch our content. Get the facts, stand for truth.